This is all the world's military spending, and this is what America spends. It's a military budget the size of the next 9 nations altogether. Inside that budget, 10 active aircraft carriers, as many as the rest of the world combined. More than 13,000 planes and helicopters, making up the largest air force on Earth, and 1.4 million active personnel stationed in almost 150 countries. The U.S. government spends 6 times more on its military than on transportation and infrastructure, and 9 times more than on education. The War and Money Project looks at how the Pentagon's budget grew, how it compares to the rest of the world, and how wasteful spending inflates an already huge figure. Where to begin is up to you. July 1947. The war is through, and a global power shift has made the United States a military superpower. To maintain that status, Harry Truman and his cabinet created the National Military Establishment, renamed in 1949 the Department of Defense. It houses a standing army unlike any the world has seen before, and commands that fighting force from a new home, the Pentagon, finished in 1943. But even as post-war military spending bottomed out in 1949, another budget climb was on the way. By 1952, it topped $500 billion adjusted for inflation. That's a spending level matched only twice in the time since. The new priority, halting the spread of communism. The Korean War and the beginning of the Cold War with the Soviet Union would dictate American military spending for the next 4 decades.
Our homes, our nation, all the things we believe in are in great danger. This danger has been created by the rulers of the Soviet Union. We will build up our own army, navy, and air force, and make more weapons for ourselves and our allies.
By 1953, as many as 1 million Korean, Chinese, American, Soviet, and British soldiers were dead or missing. In Washington, a new president took office, former General Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican. Despite his military background, Eisenhower oversaw a steep decline in defense spending. By the end of his 8 years, he cut the Pentagon's budget by more than $200 billion in today's dollars, and delivered high-profile warnings about future military buildup.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed. those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. Is there no other way the world may live?
We cannot shirk our responsibility as the leader of the free world because we're the only one that can do it. And therefore, the burden of maintaining the peace falls on us. And to maintain that peace requires strength.
1981. Ronald Reagan is president, and for the first time since before World War II, America sees a significant peacetime rise in military spending. Between 1981 and 89, Reagan's White House expanded the Pentagon budget by 35%. But unlike Korea or Vietnam, this military buildup was not to fight a war, but to prepare for one, and hopefully avert one with the Soviet Union.
I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding.
Reagan's legacy is often portrayed in broad strokes.
'Cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.
30 years later, he's celebrated by conservatives as the man who ended the Cold War.
Who is your favorite Republican president?
Ronald Reagan. Easy one. Reagan. Reagan.
Reagan.
Okay, everybody got that one right?
Critics point to his excessive spending, doubling the national debt, and to his cuts to domestic aid programs and welfare. But Reagan was a complicated figure. Although he was called a warmonger, the president opposed the high-stakes theory that had defined the Soviet-American rivalry for decades: mutually assured destruction.
Is there either logic or morality in believing that if one side threatens to kill tens of millions of our people, our only recourse is to threaten killing tens of millions of theirs?
So Reagan's Manhattan Project would be not the creation of a weapon of mass destruction, but the technology to stop one in midair, a space-based missile defense system known as Star Wars. The project would prove costly and ultimately ill-fated. It was never fully realized. For the private defense industry, the Reagan years were a windfall. Weapons procurement more than doubled, from $71 billion to more than $147 billion, making up a large chunk of Reagan's boost in military spending. But while the Pentagon's budget ballooned, other programs and departments were starved of funding. Reagan's weapons buildup would coincide with deep cuts in welfare programs.
The Department of Defense. It's the only department in our entire program that will actually be increased over the present budgeted figure.
This was the realization of what Dwight Eisenhower had warned against, a shift in budget priorities that put more money toward weapons and less toward putting food on American tables. And it's during the Reagan years that the wealth gap between rich and poor would take off. By 1989, the top 1% were almost twice as wealthy as they were in 1981, while middle and lower class incomes remained stagnant. As for defense spending, the end of Reagan's presidency marked a peak. Military budgets actually shrunk throughout the Gulf War. Ultimately, it would take another 2 Middle East conflicts to match Reagan's peacetime spending levels at the Pentagon.
Should the people of the world look at the United States, Governor, and say, should they fear us? Should they welcome our involvement? How would you project us around the world as president?
Well, I think they ought to look at us as a country that understands freedom. Our nation stands alone right now in the world in terms of power, and that's why we've got to be humble.
George W. Bush came into office pushing a modest foreign policy. But that was before 9/11, and before an initially popular war in Afghanistan, and a much more divisive one in Iraq brought historic highs in military spending and a huge shift in tone.
We will direct every resource at our command, every means of diplomacy, every tool of intelligence, every instrument of law enforcement, every financial influence, and every necessary weapon of war.
The decade-long war on terror would begin with a military budget that was already the world's largest and take it to unprecedented levels, from about $400 billion in 2001 to more than $700 billion a decade later. This includes costs of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, so far totaling about $1.4 trillion. In the last few years, defense spending, adjusted for inflation, has been higher than at any time since World War II. Today, the U.S. is finally withdrawing from its two long wars in the Middle East, but there's little reason to expect major cutbacks at the Pentagon. Partly because of new crises,
ISIS militants executed as many as 770 Iraqi soldiers.
Tanks the Ukrainians say came from Russia continue to advance through rebel strongholds.
But mainly because in the 21st century, the military budget is the government's most sacred cow. The much-feared sequestration budget cuts merely brought Pentagon spending back to 2006 levels, and even that prompted bipartisan backlash and fear-mongering.
Is going to be a death blow to the United States military.
No one in their right mind would let it happen.
So for the foreseeable future, the climb continues for America's military budget, larger than at any time during the Cold War, larger than the next 9 nations combined, and growing. China's military operates behind an especially thick veil of secrecy, which can make it difficult to filter fact from fiction. By sheer troop numbers, China has the world's largest military, with 2.3 million active personnel, and it's second only to the U.S. in military spending. That's due to consistent 10% growth in China's defense budget in each of the last 15 years. It's increased tenfold in the last quarter century, though rapid inflation means that growth isn't quite as impressive as it sounds. China's military has been described as a black box, but here's what the outside world does know about it. Despite its high troop count, what China packs in manpower, it lacks in heavy equipment and weaponry. It has only one tank division. And at sea, its navy is growing, but still far from dominant in the Pacific. It boasts one active aircraft carrier to America's 10 active carriers, and its nuclear submarines total only a tenth of the U.S. fleet. In the air, the Chengdu J-7 has long been China's go-to fighter plane, though it's now being phased out. The nation's 3,000 combat aircraft match Russia's air power and number, but total less than a quarter of the U.S. force. Looking again at China's military spending, inflation cuts away at much of the double-digit growth observers have been pointing to for years. 2010's the most notable example. That year saw a 7.8% rise in defense spending, but also a 6.7% inflation rate, meaning a real net gain of just more than 1%. There's also a question of how much impact that spending has. Unlike military powers of the West, China is surrounded by both unstable states like Pakistan and North Korea, and historical enemies like India. Japan, and the myriad Southeast Asian nations who are all pushing for the same slice of the South China Sea. So as the Far East power keeps feeding its military machine, much of its resources will go toward protecting and expanding its borders. Russia's military is in overhaul. In the eyes of its leader, Vladimir Putin, it's a once and future military superpower. Its bold and somewhat reckless maneuvering in eastern Ukraine reveals an aggression and an ambition not seen from Moscow since the fall of the Soviet Union.
It is a brazen assault on the territorial integrity of Ukraine.
But today, its bark is worse than its bite. Russia's military is due for a major update. Just as the Soviets did in the Second World War, the Kremlin still relies on aging railways to move equipment and supplies. Russia's 2008 invasion of neighboring Georgia revealed some deep-rooted flaws in its armed forces, namely subpar technology and surveillance equipment. And while its tank and armored vehicle count tops even that of America, it lags well behind the U.S. in naval and air power, falling more in line with China. At sea, Russia's only aircraft carrier is badly in need of renovation and will soon be out for repairs, seriously limiting its ability to project power globally. And its Navy boasts far fewer destroyers than other military powers. That's part of the reason Russia plans to spend $705 billion by 2020 to replace 70% of its military equipment. For the first time since the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, Russia is spending a larger portion of its GDP on its military than America is. And it plans to spend a good bit more over the next few years, anticipating a $99 billion military budget by 2016. It's a high figure, though it still won't match China's spending or come close to that of the U.S. Saudi Arabia's military is one of the world's little-known big spenders. Its budget ranks with that of the United Kingdom and France, significantly surpassed only by the US, China, and Russia. Like China, Saudi Arabia's military spending has grown rapidly in the last decade. Its defense budget was at $25 billion in 2005. Today, it's reached $67 billion. And Saudi forces have benefited heavily from good relations with the world's #1 arms exporter.
Thank you.
In 2010, the Obama administration announced America's biggest weapons deal ever, selling Saudi Arabia $60 billion worth of military aircraft over several years. That includes 84 F-15 fighter jets from Boeing and more than 100 Black Hawk and Apache helicopters. It's a big boost to one of the finer air forces in the Middle East, and a way for the U.S. to help prop up Saudi Arabia as a regional counterweight to Iran. But military spending does not translate to military might, and Saudi Arabia is a classic example of that. Only 3 countries spend more money on defense, but Saudi Arabia doesn't even crack the top 10 or maybe top 20 among the world's top military powers. That's partly because in Saudi Arabia, warfighting often takes a back seat to protecting shipping lanes and handling domestic unrest. But it's also a result of corruption in the country's defense industry. Analysts say the Saudi military effectively acts as the royal family's private army, and there are widespread reports of bribes inflating the price tag of weapons deals, which means Saudi Arabia gets less bang for its buck. France's military is a more powerful fighting force than it's given credit for. With a budget just over $61 billion, it's the fifth biggest military spender in the world, and the top spending nation in the NATO alliance next to the U.S. And despite a poor reputation stateside,
Bonjour, you cheese-eating surrender monkeys!
France is likely the boldest military power in Europe, devoting hefty resources and troop levels to conflicts in Libya in 2011, in the Central African Republic, and most recently in Mali, where the French took the lead in routing out Islamic militants intent on setting up a jihadist state. But France might never have jumped into those conflicts if its military had not undergone a serious restructuring in the last few years. In 2008, then-President Nicolas Sarkozy ordered a shift in military focus, from defending the homeland to projecting power globally. France would remake its military to respond to threats all over the world, especially in North Africa, a region too close to home for France to leave unattended. In many ways, French armed forces are on level footing with those of Britain. Depending on how you measure spending and strength, either nation in this centuries-old rivalry could come out on top. And even if France doesn't have the military might of the US, China, or Russia, its military is more formidable than the world's fourth biggest spender, Saudi Arabia. Despite being outspent, France has more aircraft, more troops, and the pièce de résistance of any modern military power, an aircraft carrier. The centerpiece for France's new global strategy. The Pentagon doesn't want it. The soldiers don't need it. But Congress will give it to them anyway, because right, left, or center, it doesn't matter. If it makes things explode and it's part of the Pentagon budget, Washington will usually fund it, even if military leaders say they're fine without it. Some examples: the A-10 Warthog, which the Air Force wants retired and lawmakers keep on paying for. The naval bases the Pentagon asked be closed and Congress kept open. Even soldier pay raises approved by Washington that go far beyond what top military brass say is warranted or necessary. And another frequent example, the M1 Abrams tank, a leftover from wars gone by that Congress refuses to let go of. Lawmakers keep funneling money to these weapons for a couple big reasons. One, because no politician wants to become this kind of target.
John Kerry has repeatedly opposed weapons vital to winning the war on terror.
But also because even if keeping these unwanted bases and weapons is bad for the federal budget, it's good for many lawmakers. See, Abrams tanks come from Lima, Ohio, and those tank factories bring jobs to Lima and keep its economy healthy. As long as Lima's economy is healthy, its voters are happy, and its lawmakers in Washington get to stay in Washington. Everyone wins, except for all the taxpayers nationwide who are paying for those tanks the Pentagon doesn't want. Many of those lawmakers also get help keeping their jobs through campaign money from defense contractors. General Dynamics, which builds those Abrams tanks, is one of America's biggest political donors. So for now, some weapons and equipment are made by manufacturers and paid for by taxpayers, whether they're wanted or not. Many C-5A Galaxy transport planes are simply towed around airstrips to keep their wheels from rotting. And hundreds of Abrams tanks leave the factory and sit unused in a California desert, because the Pentagon has no need for them and nowhere to put them. For every jet, every tank, and every missile fired, there's a price tag, and there's a private company behind it, a defense contractor.
Raytheon's proven ballistic missile defense systems provide layered defense around the world.
The story of Lockheed Martin's first 100 years has been a story of constant innovation.
The value of performance. Northrop Grumman.
And today, for those defense contractors, business is booming.
Despite U.S. defense cuts, Lockheed Martin stock is soaring, trading at all-time highs.
Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and General Dynamics also hit record highs in their stock prices.
In fact, if there's one lesson about defense contractors to be learned by the last few years, it's that the private defense industry is a lot stronger than it lets on.
It might be flattering to believe that our industry is so robust and so durable that it could absorb the impact of sequestration without breaking stride, but that is a fiction.
So stupid that the threat of it would be a prompt all by itself to public leaders to avoid it at any cost.
But this is like putting a proverbial Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Sequestration happened, and the sky didn't fall at the Pentagon or for its private contractors. A new campaign in Iraq and Syria that's relying mainly on airstrikes is great news for companies like Raytheon, the producer of Tomahawk missiles. In September, the first night of airstrikes alone cost the U.S. at least $74 million in missiles. The costs of these weapons is not just a drop in the bucket. In 2014, the U.S. spent $100 billion on weapons procurement alone, more than the Departments of Education and Transportation combined. And a major reason behind that spending is cost overrun. A 2011 audit found a third of all the Pentagon's major weapons programs since 1997 had ended up costing 50% more than planned. Only one program with a cost overrun was canceled. Pentagon leaders know weapons procurement is plagued with problems, and they've been saying so for years.
We need to continually move forward with designing an acquisition system that rewards cost effectiveness and efficiency, so that our programs do not continue to take longer, cost more, and deliver less than initially planned and promised.
I'm proud of Congress for sending me this legislation. That's why I'm going to go sign it right now. Thank you very much.
Congress has tried to address the problem, like with 2009's Acquisition Reform Act. But lawmakers left military brass the option of simply waiving legal requirements for weapons programs. And that's an option they've taken many times, including with the Pentagon's most expensive program, the F-35. The F-35 was meant to change combat as we know it. Designed to replace the military's aging fighter aircraft, this single-seat, single-engine fixed-wing craft is undetectable by radar, can take off and land vertically, and is considered the most capable stealth military jet in the world. The Pentagon was promised a Swiss Army knife in the sky, a fighter that could do everything. Its developer, defense giant Lockheed Martin, boasted no other fighter would have such versatility. But no other fighter would have this high a price tag either. The F-35 is the single most expensive weapon system ever. 2,400 of these multi-role fighters have cost the U.S. government some $400 billion so far. That's 61% more than the project's already staggering original budget drafted in 2001. And some estimates suggest the program's lifetime cost will clock in at $1.45 trillion. In some ways, the stealth aircraft program was destined to break budgets from the start. Lockheed Martin began producing the planes before they were fully tested, a process known as concurrent development.
Putting the F-35 into production years before the first test flight
was acquisition malpractice. It should not have been done, okay? But we did it.
Even though the fighters are fitted with state-of-the-art technology, they've been plagued with a series of design flaws and technical glitches, with Lockheed picking up just half the cost of fixing them.
For the record, you don't know how much the cost overrun has been for the F-35?
Not precisely.
Roughly. Do you know roughly what the cost overrun has been?
Sure, I'm assuming, says, no, I don't.
The Pentagon has had to repeatedly push back the deadline. It'll be years before any of these stealth fighters are combat ready. Making matters worse, overseas buyers are losing interest. The Netherlands already slashed its order in half, and Italy is considering doing the same, which is a problem. Sales abroad are essential to bringing down the fighters' high costs. But the Pentagon maintains the program will be finished and will be valuable. Now years overdue and billions over budget, the F-35 is simply too big to fail.